graph on this graph. And what you see is that there's a reasonably close correspondence between year-to-year changes as well in homicide and inquisitive crime. When inquisitive crime turns up, homicide rates tend to turn up. When inquisitive crime rates turn down, homicide rates tend to come down. Not inevitably. Here's a case in which we don't see the same correspondence. Here's another. But by and large, these two year-over-year change curves are fairly closely associated with one another. Now, that doesn't tell us that property crime, quote, causes changes in homicide. It does suggest that if this is a spurious relationship at the aggregate level, it is a spurious relationship that is a very, very strong one. And relationships of this magnitude really, I think, require some kind of explicitly ruling out causal mechanisms. So what I tried to do in this subsequent research was test these ideas about how the economy influences property crime, which in turn influences violent crime. And here, like the findings I showed you earlier, again, we find, here's the property crime model, which is that inquisitive crime index that I showed you on the graphs earlier. We find pretty much what we found before. Index of consumer sentiment, both its contemporaneous value and its lag value, as well as imprisonment, related to changes in property crime. Not as strongly related to changes in homicide, as you can see here. But when we put property crime in the model, we find this very strong effect on property crime on homicide. And we find no direct effect of the economy on homicide. The surprising result here, for those of you interested in such things, is we don't any longer find a direct effect of imprisonment on homicide. It looks to us in this research that imprisonment as well may be mediated by its effect on homicide, may be mediated by its effect on property crime. That requires more of a search. So these findings are not definitive with respect to demonstrating that the property crime expansions through the underground market explanation I gave you are causally related to changes in homicide. But they get us a little closer to that kind of perception. I think my own view is now we have to think a little bit more open-mindedly in criminology about how one type of crime causes another. Marcus Felsen and colleagues of Felsen's have been making this argument for quite some time. Felsen has the intriguing expression of how one type of crime feeds off another. And in fact, it was reading Felsen's Crime in Everyday Life, which is a textbook that Felsen's written, a very, very provocative one, that it struck me that this kind of analysis might be quite consistent with his argument and somewhat enlightening. There's just a summary then of what I think the relationship is between the economy, as indicated by the index of consumer sentiment, also imprisonment. Think about this as carrots and sticks. The effects on homicide tend to move through property crime. So, collective perceptions of economic change are related to changes in property crime rates and robbery. Robbery is technically a violent crime, but with a strong, obviously strong economic motive. The crime reduction effects of consumer sentiment tend to be somewhat more consistent or robust and independent of the effects of other economic indicators. Largely, I would argue, because that's an index that captures persons' subjective perceptions of their economic situation reliably, and also it's a leading indicator. The economy and imprisonment explain much of the 1990s crime drop, and as it turns out, not simply in the United States, but also in Europe. My colleague Steve Mester and I recently published a paper in which we compared economic changes and crime rate changes, in that case burglary rate changes, in the U.S. with 9 European nations, and we found the same patterns in Europe that we found in the U.S. By the way, we were not the only nation to go through a crime decline in the 90s. With about a 2-year lag, Europe went through the same crime decline. And our argument would be, for many, not all of the same reasons. And the effect of collective economic perceptions as an indicator of economic change on homicide is mediated, by and large, though not completely, by property crime. So, I suggest in the title of this presentation that we might well be working towards a unified explanation of the relationship between the economy and crime. An explanation that joins economic perspectives, the key assumption being that criminal offenders, like everyone else, respond to incentives. No matter how damaged psychologically they may be, and I guess I'm speaking to the psych students in here primarily, that's not to say that they are so completely damaged that they are incapable of responding to changes in price. There's no evidence suggesting that most criminal offenders lack the capacity to recognize changes in the value of the goods that they're after. That's why when you walk down the street, your iPhone or iPod is a lot more attractive to a would-be street robber than your shirt or your shoes. Although I have to tell you, the American Society of Criminology met in St. Louis 2 years ago, and there was a street robbery associated. A couple of graduate students from UC Irvine were stuck up on the way home from the bars late at night, about 3 in the morning. St. Louis criminals are relatively desperate, and they took the shoes from these kids, not because they thought the kids were going to chase them, they wanted to deter that, but because shoes have street value in some cases. All right, I'm not going to go in elaborate on how this perspective joins standard brand criminological perspectives, but I think it provides a framework for integrating many of them. What I want to talk now about are the challenges to my argument. For one thing, there may be direct effects of the economy on violent crime that are not captured in these analyses. I think there's good reason to believe that increases in household or so-called domestic violence are associated with increases in economic